So hi there, I'm Martin. I am affiliated with the research library at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And I will be using the acronym LANL to refer to Los Alamos National Laboratory, so LANL. If you're not familiar with the laboratory, a two-sentence summary. Google Manhattan Project. The LANL, of course, was instrumental in that in the 40s. And LANL still has a very active, of course, weapons and nuclear engineering program overall, but the research spectrum is much broader than that by now, right? We have a biochemistry division, we have theoretical physics, we have computer scientists, roughly 14,000 staff, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 scientists like myself, and a whole bunch of other folks running around. So it's a large campus, it's a large thing, right, organization. It's federally funded, so basically taxpayer-funded laboratory, research and development laboratory, and there are a total of 17 of those under the umbrella of the Department of Energy in the US. So that gives you kind of a scope of what we're talking about, right? It's a big government institution. The canonical website of LANL is lanl.gov, G-O-V, because it's a government organization, basically, and we'll be looking into what this domain looks like. So, as I'm sure everybody here knows, right, the web is very dynamic. It's an ephemeral medium, right? Things disappear all the time. Links break faster than I can give this presentation, and content changes as well, right? Sometimes that's on purpose. Sometimes that's a detriment. Things change. Things are very, very dynamic. The lab and the research library and my team in particular has a long history of R&D efforts related to what we refer to as reference rot on the web. So breaking links, content of linked pages changing. So that's kind of our wheelhouse anyways. And so we're motivated to look into how we as an organization are doing when it comes to link rot and specifically link rot, yes. We've designed in the past a number of concepts and technologies and tools to tackle the problem. Robust links is one of them. And you might be familiar with the Memento infrastructure that we're in part running, which gives you basically a federated search interface to look for archived resources across dozens of web archives around the world, as long as they are Memento compliant. Right? Thus far we've been focusing on scholarly communication because we are affiliated with the research library, so that seems like a natural fit. And here we're basically branching out a little bit. All right, I'm sure you're all familiar with link rot. If not, I've got a screenshot up here of a basically forced 404 page not found error, right? I actually did try to find a real one on the Sound Vision Institute website, but I didn't, so I forced it. You can see the URL on the bottom of this page, some random nonsense string, which in turn, returned this thing, right? And everybody can look at this, a human can look at the page, and you get the 404 error there. So you kind of realize something has gone wrong, right? This is, the feedback to the user that what you were looking for is not there. And I totally expected that, but just for the demonstration purposes, I'll put it up here. So this is what I would call a good 404, right? The human looks at the page, says, this is obviously not what I was looking for, this is gone, it's a 404, maybe I'm technically, I know what a 404 is, the HTTP response code for an error, right? And I see this in my terminal here on the left-hand side of the slide. This page indeed returns a 404 page not found response on the protocol level. So even a machine coming across this web page would realize, okay, this is an error. Something has gone wrong here. This is an instance of link rot, right? This thing is not there. So that's good in a way that a human and a machine can interpret this page and come to the same conclusion, link rot, bad, but good in terms of making that case, right? All right, we've investigated link rot a number of years ago, wrote a number of articles about this. It's bad, it's a thing, right? It happens all the time. This is an example of scholarship. So we looked at links from scholarly articles to resources on the web. And probably not all that surprising, the older the article, the higher the probability that its containing link is gone now, right? So basically, the older your link, the older your bookmark, the higher the chances are that the stuff is gone now. All right, so then we were motivated, as I alluded to look at this status basically from the laboratory's point of view. So we actually wrote a proposal to an internal funding agency, and we got some money to do this. we made the case that as a large government institution, taxpayer funded, in the age of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news and all these sort of things, we probably want to be a good steward of our stuff out there, right? This would probably make for really bad press if something crazy happened. So we probably want to have a good overview of what's there, what's not there, how to potentially fix it, and so on and so forth. It wouldn't be us if we weren't using our Memento infrastructure to then also see, well, the stuff that we didn't find that are broken, can we retrieve them? Can we find them elsewhere in an archive around the world, right? So we'll use, of course, existing infrastructure to see how much of the stuff we suspect is gone can we recover from web archives. There you go. So a fairly straightforward process, and our friends from Cambridge have done similar processes, right? So where did we start? Well, we started by trying to identify the folks at the laboratory that are in charge of the website. Well, and that's one of those cases where you ask 5 different people and you get 7 different answers of who's in charge, right? So that was not trivial. Eventually we found the group that was in charge, and we asked them, so how big is the LANL.gov domain? We're preparing for a crawl and we want to kind of know how to scope our resources, and the answer was, meh, don't know, right? So that's probably a very typical sort of scenario as well, and this is only the LANL.gov domain and everything around it, right? So we're not talking about Friesland or any other sort of a national domain. This is just LANL.gov, and we have no idea how big this domain is, which is probably not unique to the lab, but also not surprising. So we went about, asking Google, what do you know about LANL.gov? And came up with a list of subdomains that then all were in scope. We put this in our seed list, very straightforward sort of a process. Used an off-the-shelf Stormcrawler crawling environment that we had experience with prior to that, created WAC files, all the fun stuff. Crawled the outward-facing LANL.gov domain, so no intranet, nothing behind a paywall, or, well, we don't have paywalls, but nothing behind a login, anything that you and I could see sitting here, basically, right? And analyzed our crawl, of course, looked up the things that were missing in through the Memento infrastructure in dozens of web archives around the world, and we also built an archive that I'll show in a second. All right. I think our Google search, resulted in 26 or so subdomains. So something.lanl.gov, for example, cnls.lanl.gov, which stands for the Center for Nonlinear Studies, sorry. So we had a whole bunch of those. Put them all on the seed list, crawled all of that. And as you would expect, right, we're kind of naive about this and started crawling the library catalog. Probably not a good idea, so we blacklisted that thing. Eventually optimized a little bit here and there, and ended up running this thing for a bit more than a day and crawled 200,000 pages, give or take, right? So not a crazy large crawl, not a small crawl, something that I don't know whether I expected 200,000 pages to be in the LANL.gov domain, but it seemed reasonable, so we stuck with that. And almost 700 gigabytes, so whatever, not a surprising scale of the crawl, let's say. So then we found this. And this is what I call bad link rot, because it is a page that you as a human would look at and say, huh, all right, probably not what I was looking for when I clicked on the link. And it says unavailable service, so what in the world is that? Right, it's not an HTTP, a standard HTTP response. It is something that someone came up with, that's my interpretation, something that someone came up with to convey to a human that this page is gone. Well, you can argue about that, right? But this is what you get when you actually click on this news link from 2017. So just by looking at the URL, I would say, well, this was probably a news article published in 2017, and now I get this. Part of the reason why I say this is bad link rot is on the left-hand side, you see a snapshot of a memento of an archived version of that page from the Internet Archive in this case, just to give you a visual impression of what that page used to look like. And it now redirects to this unavailable service page. It's a fairly common scenario. You see a lot of domains and web pages in general that redirect to something else when they encounter an error, right? A lot of domains will actually not show you a 404, but just redirect to the index page, for example, for convenience reasons. And that's, I think, is an example of that. It gets worse though. because this is what we refer to as a soft 404, right? And on the page, as I mentioned, you see this human interpretable error message. On the protocol level, however, this returns an HTTP 200, which to a machine means everything is peachy, right? You got there. You got what you were looking for, and that, of course, is bad. Right? You have a human with one conclusion, basically, of inspecting the page, and you have a machine coming to a different conclusion, inspecting the very same page. Well, now you would say this may not be that bad. You can write a script or whatever to detect those sort of things. Sure, you can, but it has consequences that may not be all that obvious at first. This one is one of them. There are a bit more than 32,000 mementos, archived copies of this error page in the Internet Archive alone, right? So I haven't checked Library of Congress or other web archives for archived copies of this. So you're actually really tricking machines into making archival copies of the same error page over and over and over and over again, right? Not good. I just ran this little brief experiment. If you Google LANL service unavailable, of course you get this page, right, as a top result. If you Google LANL service, available service, this page shows up as the 8th result or something like that, right? So, because available, unavailable is somewhat similar. So that's really, really bad. These soft 404s are really, really bad because you're telling a machine something that is not true, right? The machine misinterprets this sort of environment. So we had to somewhat modify our process in a way that of course, we had to detect those things while crawling, because otherwise it would completely mess up our statistics. And we also had to implement some sort of logic to dismiss mementos, so archived copies of this error page when we were actually looking for real archived copies of real content, right? So we need to filter those things out for your statistics, because otherwise you're not telling the truth. All right, so then we went to briefly analyze the crawl, and we did this on a very high level. This is not super scientific, this is not rocket science, pun intended, but there are some good news and some bad news here. So these are just the response codes from the pages that we crawled, so that's again on the HTTP level. And the good news is that 3 out of 4 pages have an HTTP 200 response code, so that's good, I guess. I would assume you would expect more, but it could be worse, I guess, right? But then this is really weird. This is an HTTP 502. Shouldn't happen, but maybe that's a transient error. Maybe if we optimize our crawler a little bit, maybe if we ran it again, that number may change. So I'm not really sure. This is really weird too. It's a 200 level response code. If you're familiar with HTTP, that's a redirect. So by definition, this should not be the end of the line, right? Redirect means there's something else to come. So no crawler should stop there. That's really weird. But I'm not too concerned because, again, if we optimized, ran again, maybe those numbers would change. This, however, is really, really bad. These are the soft 404s that I refer to, right? Again, the crawler thinks this is a 200, everything is fine, but it actually is not. And yeah, it's only 3,500 pages, it's only 2%, right, but of 200,000 crawl or whatever. But as I showed a second ago, right, crawlers think that's good, and search engine thinks that's good. So this is, I think, really, really bad. So then we ignored the 500 errors, we ignored the 300 errors, we only looked at those soft 404s and tried to figure out where do they occur, first of all, and second of all, how can we potentially, and from where, recover them from existing web archive collections. All right. So this is not necessarily meant to be read, but on the x-axis here, you have all the subdomains where we found those soft 404s, and the takeaway message here really is the vast majority of them are, 2 takeaway messages. The vast majority, are from basically the canonical URI, right? lanl.gov and www.lanl.gov. So that's where we find most of the soft 404s. But secondly, interestingly enough, I think there's a long, long tail of subdomains where we do find some of those. Not a lot of them, but some of them. So, right, in aggregate, this long tail becomes really significant, which tells me that this is not the implementation of these soft 404s was not a decision by, let's say, one division or one group or one administrator. This was an institutional thing across the board, which probably is good news because then you probably have to talk to 2 or 3 people and convince them to, quote unquote, do the right thing rather than talking to 14,000 people at the lab, right? So that's good and bad news, let's put it this way. So then where and how, first of all, do we recover things from the web infrastructure, the publicly and openly available web infrastructure? Well, of course, we're at Los Alamos, we're using Memento. So we utilized our time travel infrastructure, depicted here on the left-hand side, asked them, hey, do you know of copies of this article published in 2017, and yes, indeed, in this case, it returns an archival copy, a memento, from the Internet Archive. So that's kind of the process, right? And while this slide shows the user interface of how to do this, manually, if you will, there are APIs behind this that you can use to automatically run these sort of lookup and federated search services. And the yellow fraction of the corresponding bars represents the number of URIs of pages that we were able to recover from the web infrastructure, right? The web archive infrastructure. So from anywhere in the world, we found a few good copies of those initial pages. And again, this is really hard to read, and that's intentional. So I blew it up a little bit. And you see most of the pages that we were able to recover, we're also able to recover from lanl.gov and www.lanl.gov, which is kind of intuitive because web archives are also often focused on popularity. So index pages are probably more frequently archived than some other crazy subdomains. But what is interesting, I find it humorous that we exactly recovered 404 of those soft 404s, right? So that's kind of cool. And no, I didn't mess with the numbers, that was real. And I also want to stress, because that's where, again, the power of Memento comes in, that we found, of course, expectedly so, the vast majority of our soft 404s that we were able to recover in the Internet Archive. But there were other archives that contributed to this pool, right? So Library of Congress Web Archive, for example, Archivo, and even the Icelandic folks, they contributed unique soft 404 pages that we're able to recover that were not in the Internet Archive, right? So it's kind of our regular counter argument to the point, oh, Internet Archive has everything, we don't need anyone else. No, that's not true, right? Together we are strong, sort of thing, yeah. So that's just the point that I wanted to make there. Okay. So I mentioned that, of course, we're crawling and we're creating VARCs, and then we're go a step further, of course, and build this LANL-based web archive. So in there is everything that we crawled this one time for demonstration purposes, and also for purposes to convince stakeholders, let's say, that with an infrastructure like this, we can actually do the right thing and fix our 404s, even if they're soft, right? So this is publicly available. Please feel free to check it out. Of course, it's Memento compliant, so it plays nicely with the other web archives and can be discovered. I mentioned that this was an internally funded project, so of course for the final report we had to come up with somewhat fancy visualizations. So this is the LANL domain, and also interesting in a way that when we started this effort we had no idea. So what does a domain look like? What's the hubs? What are the nodes, and so on and so forth? We had no idea. It requires further analysis to get more of an idea, but at least that's a starting point, basically, right? Some more domains. This is actually inspired by Tim Sherritt's from Australia, visualization of the Australian domain, just trying to visualize how the subdomains are connected within the lanl.gov outward-facing web space. And then there's two things that I see and I try to lobby for basically at the laboratory of how to move forward with this, right? First of all, not of course, but the notion of establishing a web archiving program, because we don't have any, is probably a good idea. Probably, I would assume that the laboratory, down the road, thinks that relying on the publicly accessible web archiving infrastructure, like the Internet Archive, for archival copies of our stuff is probably not a proposition that can fly, right? So the lab is built around secrecy, so we probably only trust ourselves. And then you have the usual things of, how often would you crawl your own web space and what's in scope and not, and those sort of things. However, I'm also trying to lobby in favor of something more proactive, right? So we're publishing a web page. Well, we should immediately archive it rather than retroactively trying to figure out where in the world our URLs are. And that probably goes towards, and that ties into the library again, right? We're publishing an article, we're publishing a PDF document sort of thing, can we extract the references from there? proactively archive it, either in our own infrastructure or in someone else's, to do the right thing there for the scholarly record, if you will. All right, I'll stop it there. So I just want to stress a couple of points, right? So even if you pay your taxes on time, there's nothing inherently stable about government websites, right? Things break all the time, whether it's LANL or something else, things break. That's a given. So there is a notion of, we've shown this with our outcome, right? We're by far not able to recover everything that's gone, so the notion of just sitting back, relying on the inner archive to come by and crawl it is not going to cut it. Right? So this, what I would call incidental web archiving, is not a reliable proposition when you're looking at coverage, really, right? We've also tried to make the case that spreading the wealth, basically, right? Archiving in different places is a good thing because together they contribute individually. And what I find fascinating is this notion of the laboratory as an, again, government-funded, taxpayer-funded large institution. We probably at some point have this notion, well, was something that we published really online? How do we prove this, right? If something comes up, if someone debates whether something was really online. So it's then probably up to us to prove that it was actually online. So the audit notion, I think, is really a strong motivator for an institution like mine. Of course, there's always the notion of storytelling, right? How has the lab evolved over the last 15 years or so? So archived resources are probably a good source for that. And then also looking, I mentioned there are 16 other labs like ours. Some are smaller, some are larger, I'm not sure. So could this be a service model sort of thing for other DOE labs and libraries there as well, right? So those are the things that we're looking at in terms of takeaways. I'm out of time. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for having me. That was fun. Thank you.